Hi, Jonathan Hetterly here with Psych Cinema. Today we're going to be exploring the psychology found in the Lyn Ramsey, Joaquin Phoenix film, You Were Never Really Here. Psych Cinema is Shrink Tank's video series where I explore the psychology found in the films that I watch and love. Now before we get started, do me a favor. Subscribe to our channel and click on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out any time we drop new content that explores the intersection of pop culture and psychology. Now, I'm going to be talking about the film You Were Never Really Here, so if you haven't seen it, spoiler alert, I can't really talk about it without giving a lot away. So if you haven't seen the film yet, pause, go watch the film, then come back because you're definitely going to want to hear what I bring up. First and foremost, let me just give you a very brief synopsis and my overall take. This film essentially is about one character named Joe, played by Joaquin Phoenix, and he is struggling with severe trauma, but he also has a very traumatic job. He hunts down and retrieves victims of human sex trafficking. And with that, he is hired to retrieve young girls and then to dole out punishment for the perpetrators. This film is incredibly dark. It is a incredibly tense and unsettling film, and I absolutely loved it. It just activates all my stress hormones. It's very tense. My wife was only listening to it, and the score itself is very nerve-wracking. It's going to be a very polarizing film, as we're going to talk about here. It is not for everyone, but if you're interested in trauma and psychology as an experience of a film, I highly recommend you view You Were Never Really Here. Now with that, I want to talk about really 3 to 4 things. And I'm not really going to be talking so much thematically about the film, but how the filmmaker Lyn Ramsey uses the medium of filmmaking to immerse the audience into what it might be like to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. The reality is the film in its traditional setting is almost like an anti-psychology film. There's not a lot of psychodynamic exposition. We're not given a lot of backstory on the main character, Joe, or even some of the other ancillary characters. So for the most part, the action just moves forward without a lot of backstory. We don't get to really hear motive. We don't even get full explanations about the traumatic background of its characters, and Lyn Ramsey, the director, requires the audience to be smart and to take little snippets of hints and put them together to help us articulate what is going on. So while the film is also anti-psychology in that it doesn't give us a lot of psychodynamic background, it doesn't give us motives or backgrounds of the characters, even the filmmaking itself gets us possibly into the head of the main character, Joe. When he is rescuing victims of human trafficking, the filmmaking cuts quickly and there's gaps of sequences. So even with the music, in one very interesting scene where the filmmaker uses security camera footage to show us what's happening, it quickly cuts and there's moments that it skips over. And the music that's playing, even if it's a popular song with lyrics, it jumps as well. So you recognize there are moments where the viewer and the character isn't fully conscious and things aren't just happening in an uninterrupted sequence. Another aspect that Lyn Ramsey very smartly chose as a filmmaker was she doesn't show a lot of the graphic, violent acts. She shows the aftermath. We know that it's happened. You see all these scenes where on a very low point of view, you see a body on the ground and you see the legs of Joe, the main character, walking past. So we're left to understand that he has done some type of horrific violent act to overtake that person, but we don't see it. We just see the aftermath. And this kind of reinforces the emotionally muted character of Joe, to where what might as a viewer be very horrific and off-putting for us to see, he's detached from it. And more we start to understand that when we get through some of the trauma, but from a filmmaking standpoint, the very frantic score by Johnny Greenwood of Radiohead adds to the tension, adds to the buildup of noise. It's not particularly melodic. The tempo tends to change. There's a lot of off-key strings and piano or keyboards that's intended for tension and threat and dissonance to be felt by the audience. And so on some ways, you know something is going to happen, but the filmmaker doesn't actually provide us the audio of a lot of the violence and action sequences. You just hear the music, and then you see the aftermath. And that really represents Joe, because Joe is basically a living representation of a dead man walking. He is alive, but he's not all there. He is a shell of who we expect him to be. And so it's really interesting when we start to see little flashbacks, and there's a lot of flashbacks, but they're very quick, but they're repeating, that throughout the very lean 85 minutes of this film, you start to put together maybe some of what Joe has been exposed to in his life that helps us to understand maybe why he's so remote, why he's so detached and removed from his feelings or being able to express it with others. And Lyn Ramsey adapted this film from a short novella, and what we learned from the novella, and she actually showed a longer cut, I believe it was at the Toronto Film Festival, that later on continued to get edited in the version that was released, is that Joe is a Iraqi war veteran, that he had childhood abuse at the hands of his father. His father and mother, it looked like they were both victims of that. So when we look at the original source material and a longer cut of the film, we learn a little bit more about Joe's backstory. He was severely abused and traumatized as a child. In fact, we see that his dad both abused his mother and him with a certain type of hammer that he chooses as an adult whenever he goes out with his jobs of tracking down traffickers and retrieving the victims of that. He uses the same type of ball-peen hammer that his father did on him and his mother, and which creates some interesting undertones of a victim becoming now the perpetrator of violence. Although in his sense, he feels like he is saving people, underage people, from abuse, whereas he was helpless to do so when he was a kid. We also learned that he's a war veteran, and that he served some type of role, most likely with the FBI, helping track down human trafficking cases. So he's seen a lot of trauma, and there's one real quick flashback that we see, I think we see it more than one time, where it looks like he finds a container where it's the bodies of victims of human trafficking. And he's triggered with that memory by a very innocuous incident on the streets of New York, where a group of young Asian girls just ask if he would take a picture of them as they pose. And it triggers this memory of finding a container full of underage girls and their bodies. And it just kind of shows no matter what, even a very benign everyday interaction with life, Joe just has all of this trauma that he's carrying around. And in fact, the only thing that seems to give him a purpose for living is taking care of his aging mom. But both of them are very removed from life. And I think we can sort of surmise that some of that has to do with the trauma and the traumatic life that they have lived. Because we know that Joe struggles with chronic suicidality, we see throughout the film of him asphyxiating himself with plastic bags up until his mom calls for him and he gets out of that. There's a flashback where he's doing the same thing as a young child. We see him contemplating jumping off a train ramp. We see him playing with knives, throwing it down at his foot, and at the last second moving his foot. Seeing that several times. We see at one point he has a knife and he's looking to swallow it, inflict great pain until his mom calls him. And in the source material, it's revealed that he would never take his own life until, while his mom was alive, because he's the only one that can take care of him. But we know he struggles with reason to live and the suffering that he experiences. But with that comes this one central role or job that he has, which is to rescue the underage daughter of someone that's running, I believe, for like state senate or governor. And with that, he sees a girl who's been battered and traumatized differently than him, but he sees himself in that girl. And just like he was helpless to save himself and his mom from the trauma and the abuse that he occurred in his own childhood, he makes it his mission to save this girl, and thereby finding some element of redemption for himself. Because one of the things that Joe experiences, and this is something that even working with folks that struggle with suicidal thoughts, is it's not just reducing the desire or reasons to take one's life. It's increasing all the reasons to live and to be alive and to have purpose. And for Joe, the one thing that gives him purpose isn't necessarily rescuing people, because he does that for a living. And yet he continually struggles with thoughts of ending his life. The purpose that Joe has for living is being able to take care of somebody, that somebody needs him on a deep personal level, not anonymous, somebody that they cannot take care of themselves without him. Joe needs to be needed on a very fundamental and personal level. And so that shows through the end of the film that even though he is a broken man, and even though the girl he saves is a broken young girl, together they think that they might be able to forge a life by helping each other, because they both need to be needed and they need to help somebody else. Now again, this is not this is not a film just draped with exposition, so you're gonna have to pay attention to this. And if the idea of sort of like from a very sensory standpoint, immersing yourself into trauma and grief and the horrific ills of human trafficking is not your cup of tea, then I recommend you shy away from this film. But make no mistake, this is a remarkable achievement in filmmaking, and for those of you interested, I highly recommend it. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Psych Cinema. Tell me, what did you think? Have you watched You Were Never Really Here? And did you find it as unsettling but masterful as I did? Or was the lack of exposition just too much for you to take? Did you want more character development, backstory? I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions about the film. You can also leave me recommendations of other films that you would like for me to tackle here on Psych Cinema. You can follow me on Twitter, and be sure to check out shrinktank.com, where you're going to find more content, articles, videos, quizzes, and more that explores the intersection of pop culture and psychology. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. My name is Jonathan Hetterly. I'll see you again at the movies.